A recent report published by the Ichikowitz Family Foundation has found that the youth are less optimistic about the future of South Africa. The South African Special Edition 30 Years of Democracy survey, conducted through over 1,000 face-to-face interviews, reveals that almost half the youth, 49% in the 18 to 24-year-old category, say they are likely to vote later this month. 16% say they will not, and there's another 35% that are still undecided. And these are concerning numbers, which we'll discuss right now with Reuben Ichikowitz from the Ichikowitz Family Foundation. Good morning, Reuben, and thank you very much for being with me in our studio today. I think a good place to start is to share with our viewers a sense of the parameters and why you undertook the study.
So this 30-year of democracy special edition of the survey is part of our broader African Youth Survey, which we've conducted since 2020. This is the third edition. We conduct face-to-face interviews we've conducted in 25 countries to date across the continent, and this gives us an ability to get a sense of the pulse on a face-to-face, in-depth basis of youth's thoughts, aspirations, fears and concerns around the continent. And it gives us a really interesting data set, because not only are we able to look introspectively within a country and compare on provincial bases, but we can also benchmark South Africa to the rest of the continent. And now that we are 4 or 5 years down the line, we're able to start seeing some trends, some which are positive and some which are also concerning.
Which I actually want to come back to, because you would think that living in a war-torn country means that you would be less inclined to be a part of any kind of democratic process, and yet what we're seeing in terms of that contrast with South Africa is a different picture. Surprising. So we'll circle back to that one, Reuben. But 85% of your respondents said that they were very concerned about government corruption. This is, interestingly, a 20% jump from the previous survey that you conducted on this point. Understandably, the proportion of those concerned about unemployment jumped to 82% from 70%. Again, these are exponential increases. And I want to focus on jobs, because Stats SA tells us that the number of unemployed youth has increased by 87,000 to around 4.7 million, a massive number. And there was a decrease in almost 100,000 employed youth to now 5.9 million. What are some of the barriers that the young people you surveyed say are there, standing in their way of employment?
So it's interesting. The top 3 barriers, number 1 is corruption. This has been an overarching theme to a lot of the answers in the survey. They feel that corruption is forming a barrier to entry into specific sectors and into the public sector as well. In addition to that, and it's interesting because it corroborates with the Stats SA research, is the youth feel that there just aren't sufficient well-paying enough jobs. So there's a feeling that there's a contraction in the amount of jobs that are available. And the third reason, which I thought was actually quite interesting, is a growing sense of frustration in the job application process, and that being very complicated, and there being a lot of friction, not hearing back, having to run multiple processes at the same time was something that bubbled to the top as well.
Just gives you a sense of the psyche of those young people that you spoke to, which forms a sample of a bigger cohort of that demographic just across the country. What it must feel like to go through those grinding, obstacles every single day, and how it affects them. Almost 3/4 of the respondents say that they felt that the country was going in the wrong direction, compared to 63% in 2023 and 50% in 2020. Again, I mean, these numbers are moving quite significantly. Their despondency levels are growing. Why are they less and less optimistic about the future? We've spoken about corruption and unemployment, but you've done quite a wide band of questions trying to just excavate what's driving this despondency, and I'd love for you to share that with us.
So this statistic is one of the most concerning for me personally, because when we look at the youth's view on whether the country is going forward in the right direction or wrong direction, and we take a cross-section across Africa, in the 16 countries that we surveyed this year, South Africa had the highest amount of disappointment in the direction of the country amongst the youth. Now, we've spoken about corruption, we've spoken about lack of employment. These are recurring themes that come to bear here. One of the other interesting questions which we asked was, to what extent has South Africa changed since apartheid, since the dawn of democracy? And one of the nuances which we've picked up is perhaps when you compare South Africa to the rest of the continent, expectations were set a lot higher here 30 years ago, and have repetitively government has repetitively tried to keep the bar very high, and this born-free generation has now grown up. 18 to 24-year-olds were born well after the dawn of democracy in this country, and they've grown up in this world of high expectation but poor delivery.
And so I think I want to go to this question next then, because I found it interesting and saddening, Reuben, that sentiment in South Africa by these young people is deteriorating, and worse than in countries where there is insurgency and insecurity. Think of places like Chad and Nigeria. And the question I was going to ask you was how a relatively stable country can be thought of worse than those countries. But I think you've just given me a clue in what you're saying, is that in a context where a North Star has been set, hope has been created, and the expectation that you would be taken along that journey of growth and you would grow with the country, when that dream is deferred, when those hopes are dashed, the impact is much deeper and much higher.
I think you're spot on, and it's something that we want to be able to poll in our next editions, to be able to unpack some of those key drivers. What does give me hope is, although youth are despondent in the direction of the country, they still feel empowered, they still feel that their voice counts, and they are still very ambitious. And maybe that's linked in with this hope as well, that our youth are driving for high standards. They are not settling for mediocrity, and what's frustrating them is that they're stuck in the system. But it's a positive silver lining here to see that there is that real drive.
And that's also, that's heartening, isn't it? It's a bittersweet, reality. There's despondency, but still, they feel that their agency is still there. Which I think then fits in beautifully with the next question, because 49% of the 18 to 24-year-old category say they are likely to vote later this month. We've got that 16% that say, well, we're not going to do it, and 35% that are now sitting on the fence and undecided. If political parties are really listening, they should pay attention to the concerns that are being expressed by this cohort, potentially read, your report, and fight really hard to convert those who are undecided into votes for themselves. Even though we don't want to be that mercenary, thinking, tailor a message, because young people see very clearly between, spin and making sort of vain and empty promises with a party that's really desirous of seeing their lot improve.
Correct. So we've got this 34% that's undecided on the fence, and I think that part of what's driving that is the timing of the survey. I think that the closer we get to elections, we'll see that gap narrowing. But you also raise an interesting point around political messaging and spin, and it was something else that we polled around trust in the media, trust in politicians.
What do they say?
And the realm of fake news, and they acknowledge it as a real challenge, that they're having to digest lots of different messages, lots of political rhetoric that needs to be filtered, that there isn't necessarily high levels of trust. So you're spot on. They're seeing through the spin, and perhaps that's fueling some of the uncertainty, and hopefully the 34% that's on the fence is busy digesting which parties they can resonate with, and they're at least registered. We saw higher levels of voter registration than the previous poll. The previous poll was around municipal elections and not national elections, so perhaps it was a little bit different. But that's another positive indicator that the overall voter population is increasing in registration by our numbers. But there's this huge 34% that might not show up.
As you say, this is, by all accounts, this is really one of the most hyped elections, I suppose, after 94, that South Africa is heading towards. And we hear so many aspects of the story of us, because we're using a different, number of yardsticks to measure where we are after this 30 years and this amazing milestone. And there's a compendium of insights that are pulling together to form a picture, sometimes contradictory though, because you'll hear really glowing reports of where we are as a country in terms of the provision of certain services, for example. And then on the other side, you see a huge cohort, really important demographic, the next generation, or this and the next generation, feeling so disaffected. What are some of the other insights that you gleaned in this report that you really think the public ought to know about this particular demography?
So one of the completely surprising outcomes for us is we asked a relatively simple question around the youth's view on the effectiveness of democracy as a form of government. Now,
oh yes, please. This was interesting.
Now this should be a slam dunk question. We support democracy, but that wasn't actually what we found. We found that there is a 20 to 25% population that says perhaps the style of democracy, whether it's Western style or African style democracy, perhaps that is not as effective as it could be in running our country. And this is an interesting one, and it's one that we're going to invest significant effort into unpacking what's underlying this, and if not democracy, what are the views that you think could be interesting.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about. Was there an alternative that they had suggested? I mean, are they suggesting dictatorships and autocracies? I mean, everyone, and especially in that generation, would probably still have somebody in their family, who lived under apartheid, so the memory of apartheid is really fresh, or somebody who might have sacrificed, have paid a really high price for us to obtain this democracy that we have.
That's true. There's also this demographic was born after apartheid as well, so they haven't lived in that environment. But this question existed because of the 15 other countries that we polled around the continent, and in West Africa, where there've been military coups recently. Our previous data showed in those countries that there was higher levels of concern with democracy, and today those countries have undergone military dictatorships, which in a way the youth signalled to. Now we're not trying to draw any conclusions from that, but that's why this question was in the survey. It was for the rest of the continent and not necessarily for South Africa. So we don't want to jump to any conclusions in terms of what the alternatives are, but we're going to look into that very seriously.
I mean, I had a look at the hard copy compilation, and there's so many rich data sets that you have managed to extrapolate from the survey. And as you say, it's been ongoing, so you've got the ability to be able to track back at previous data sets. You're also beginning to create some trends as well, so there's a lot of data in there that would be really great reading in how you cater for young people, especially for our purposes here in South Africa. Who should be reading it? I mean, I found it really fascinating, and it's put together in a really interesting sort of way. Who should be reading this? Automatically, you think, anyone who's working with young people, anyone who's creating policy for young people, should have this in front of them so they can actually see who they're catering for and talking to.
What we like about this data set is it's completely versatile to so many different audiences. So there's no one specific target market for this. On the one hand, I think for policymakers and politicians, it provides an insight into what's often a disconnected demographic. There's a real generational shift or generational difference. In other parts of the continent, we see even larger age gaps between the political ruling class and the youth as well. So on the one hand, it resonates with them, and over the last 4 or 5 years, we've had significant engagements there. We're also finding that it resonates a lot in the international investor community, who are looking at this as ways to be able to assess, on the one hand, risks, on the other hand, opportunities. Part of our survey speaks about entrepreneurship, speaks about the telecommunications industry, the media industry, agriculture, etc. And there are positive indicators in those chapters in terms of youth's entrepreneurial drive and their desire for higher education, and we think that's a set as well. And lastly, I think it's critical that youth engage with this and say, this is capturing my views, or hold on, it's not.
Yeah. And how can they do that very quickly, Reuben, before we go? Can they come to, is it the Foundation's website?
They can come to the Foundation's website, africayouthsurvey.com, as well, and welcome collaborators on all of the data.
Perfect, really insightful. Thank you for sharing with us, Reuben. Appreciate you. Reuben Ichikowitz with the Ichikowitz Foundation.